The moment my body hit the stairs, I knew two things at once: that the pain was going to come later, and that Margaret was already speaking. Oh my God, she slipped! Her voice reached the room below before I did. Calm, clear, certain. The kind of certainty people trust without questioning, especially when it comes from someone who has spent decades being believed. I landed sideways halfway down the staircase, my shoulder colliding with the railing hard enough to knock the air from my lungs. The polished wood burned against my palms as I tried to brace myself, and for a few seconds all I could do was stay still and breathe through the shock. My heart was pounding so loudly that it drowned out the murmurs rising from the living room. Margaret stood at the top of the stairs looking down at me, one hand pressed to her chest as if she were the one in distress. Her expression was already arranged into concern, her posture upright and composed. If anyone had walked in at that exact moment, they would have seen a gracious hostess reacting to an unfortunate accident. They would not have seen her hand on my back seconds earlier. The living room filled quickly. Women I barely knew rushed forward, heels clicking against the hardwood, napkins clutched to their chests. Someone set a glass down too hard on the table. Someone else laughed nervously, unsure whether this was serious or embarrassing. Margaret's annual charity brunch always brought the same crowd: donors, neighbors, church friends, people who trusted her instinctively because she had spent years curating that trust. "Aisha, don't try to get up," Margaret said as she descended the stairs carefully, each step measured. "You moved too fast. I told you those stairs were slippery." Her words landed cleanly in the space between us, and I understood immediately what she was doing. She was not reacting, she was narrating. She was giving everyone a version of events before I could speak, before my body even finished absorbing what had happened. I tried to sit up, but the movement sent a sharp wave of pain through my side, and I let out a sound I didn't recognize as my own. Someone gasped. Another woman reached for my arm. "Oh, honey," one of them said, crouching beside me, "that was a bad fall." Margaret was close now, close enough that I could see the tightness in her jaw beneath the concern. Her eyes flicked briefly to the living room, where her guests stood frozen, watching. Then she looked back at me, and her voice softened further. "I kept telling her to slow down," she said, not to me but to the room. "She just rushed right past me." I stared at her, still on the floor, and the truth pressed against my chest harder than the pain. She was lying without hesitation, not defensively, not desperately. She was lying the way people do when they have already decided the outcome. Someone called my name again, and I realized my husband had pushed his way through the crowd. Caleb stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face pale, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides as he looked from me to his mother. His eyes searched mine first, then moved to her, and I saw the hesitation form before he said a single word. "What happened?" he asked. Margaret answered before I could open my mouth. "She slipped," she said again, just as calmly. I was right behind her. Caleb knelt beside me then, his voice low, urgent, asking if I could move, if anything felt broken. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on my body, waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would cry, whether I would accuse, whether I would embarrass myself in front of them. I met Margaret's gaze over his shoulder, and for the first time she looked at me directly without the mask fully in place. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. This was already done. I understood something in that moment that changed everything. This was not an accident born from temper or loss of control. This was deliberate. She had chosen a moment when there were witnesses and a narrative advantage. She had chosen the top of the stairs, the one place where a push could be explained away as carelessness. She had chosen me. Someone suggested calling an ambulance. Someone else said I should lie down until help arrived. Margaret hovered just enough to look attentive, but she never touched me again. She let others do that work, let them fuss and murmur while she stayed composed. "I feel so terrible," she said, shaking her head slowly. "I should have insisted she wait." Caleb looked at her, then back at me, uncertainty written all over his face. He was already trying to make sense of it in a way that did not require him to confront what I was seeing clearly. "I can stand," I said, finally, my voice rough but steady. The room went quiet. Caleb helped me up carefully, his hands trembling as he supported my weight. Pain flared through my side, but I forced myself to stay upright. I refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of watching me collapse again. "I think we should go," I said, not raising my voice, not asking permission. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, the first real crack in her performance. "Aisha, there's no need to make a scene," she said gently. "Everyone is concerned." I turned to her then, still leaning on Caleb, and looked at her fully, not with anger, not with tears, with clarity. "There's already been a scene. I'm just leaving it." A few people shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. Caleb hesitated, then nodded, guiding me toward the door as murmurs followed us. Margaret remained at the staircase, watching, her expression frozen somewhere between offense and disbelief. As we stepped outside, the cool air hit my face and sharpened my thoughts. My body hurt. My pride was bruised. But beneath it all, something else had settled into place. She thought this was over. She was wrong. As Caleb helped me into the car, I looked back at the house one last time, at the windows glowing with laughter and confusion, and I made myself a promise that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with resolve. She had pushed me down the stairs and decided the story. I was going to decide the ending. People assume betrayal announces itself loudly, with obvious villains and clear warnings. That was never my experience. What I lived through unfolded quietly, disguised as concern, tradition, and family values that were always flexible when they benefited Margaret and rigid when they didn't. From the outside, my marriage looked balanced. Caleb had a stable career, I had mine, and together we lived comfortably in a neighborhood Margaret loved to brag about to her friends. What no one saw was how much of that stability came from choices I made long before Margaret ever decided she didn't like me. When Caleb and I first married, his income was inconsistent. He had talent, ambition, and good intentions, but he also had a habit of assuming things would work out. I was the opposite. I budgeted, I planned, I took promotions that demanded more responsibility because I understood something he didn't yet. Security is not accidental. I paid off debt that wasn't mine. I covered gaps when his work slowed down. I said yes to overtime and no to vacations. When we bought the house, my credit made it possible. When we furnished it, most of what people complimented came from my bonuses and careful saving. Margaret knew all of this. She never acknowledged it directly, but she never missed an opportunity to frame it differently. She called my work temporary focus, as if I were indulging a phase. She reminded me, often and publicly, that family should come first, which was her way of suggesting that any hour I spent building financial stability was time stolen from her son. When Zuri was born, those expectations hardened. Margaret criticized choices I made quietly and praised Caleb loudly for things we decided together. If I enforced a boundary, she called it sensitivity. If I stayed silent, she called it agreement. Over time, she learned exactly how far she could push without being confronted. Caleb noticed some of it. He noticed enough to apologize occasionally, but never enough to act decisively. He preferred smoothing things over to drawing lines. He believed that love meant endurance, even when endurance came at my expense. I told myself it was manageable. I told myself that peace was worth the effort. I told myself that not every slight needed a response. What I didn't tell myself was that Margaret was paying close attention. She was watching what I tolerated, measuring it, and filing it away. The first real warning came months before the fall, and I ignored it because it didn't fit the version of her I wanted to believe in. We were alone in her kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when she mentioned the stairs casually. She said she worried about liability now that she hosted more events, especially with people who aren't careful. I remember pausing, dish in my hand, because the way she said it felt deliberate. When I looked at her, she smiled and said she meant older guests. I accepted that explanation because it was easier than questioning why the comment had felt aimed at me.
After the fall, lying awake that night with pain radiating through my side, I replayed moments like that one over and over. The comments, the looks, the way she always positioned herself as reasonable while framing me as reactive. The next morning, before Caleb woke up, my phone buzzed with a message from my friend Renee. She had been at the brunch. She worked in property management and noticed details other people missed. Her message was simple. "Are you okay? And do you know if Margaret's cameras cover the staircase?" My chest tightened as I read it. I told her I wasn't sure. She responded almost immediately. "I'm almost certain they do. I remember her talking about cloud storage when she upgraded the system last year. Also, the timestamps matter." I sat up slowly, every movement reminding me of what my body had been through, and stared at my phone. Renee wasn't dramatic. She didn't exaggerate. If she thought something mattered, it usually did. I asked her what she meant. She called me instead. Hearing it from someone else shifted something inside me. What I had felt instinctively now had shape. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family tension. This was about intent. I ended the call and sat in the quiet bedroom listening to Caleb breathe beside me, and understood the stakes with absolute clarity. If I stayed silent, Margaret would own the story forever.
If I spoke without proof, I would be dismissed as emotional. And if I moved carefully, strategically, I could protect myself, my daughter, and everything I had built. This wasn't just about the fall. It was about years of control disguised as kindness, and the moment she decided I was expendable. And for the first time, I stopped asking myself how to keep the peace and started asking how to end the game. I didn't announce my decision. There was no dramatic moment where I stood up and declared anything. The shift happened quietly, in the space between pain and clarity, when I realized that waiting for fairness was no longer an option. The morning after Renee's call, I asked Caleb to take Zuri to school. I told him I needed the house quiet. He hesitated, asked if he wanted him to stay, and I said no with a firmness that surprised both of us. Once the door closed behind them, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, my phone, and a notebook I hadn't used in years. The first thing I did was separate emotion from action. I wrote down what had happened exactly as it occurred, without adjectives, without interpretation. Time, location, witnesses, Margaret's words, my injuries. I treated it the way I treated operational problems at work. Facts first, feelings later. Then I made my first call. The attorney Renee recommended didn't ask me how I felt. She asked me what I wanted to protect. When I told her I wanted my daughter safe, my finances intact, and my credibility preserved, she nodded as if I had said the only things that mattered. "Then we move quietly," she said, "and we move first." By the end of that call, I had instructions. Document everything. Do not confront, do not threaten, do not hint at what I knew. Control was the advantage now, and control required discipline. I logged into every account that afternoon. Joint checking, savings, credit cards. Investment portals Caleb barely paid attention to because I managed them. I didn't drain anything. I didn't hide money. I created clean separations, redirected my income, froze discretionary access where I could. I left enough visible stability that nothing would raise immediate suspicion. Next, I pulled property records. The house was jointly owned, but the down payment trail told a story Margaret would never like seeing in court. I saved copies of everything and backed them up twice, one digital, one physical. When Caleb came home that evening, he found me packing a single suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice confused rather than angry. "I'm staying with Renee for a few days," I said. "Zuri needs consistency right now, and I need space to think." His brows knit together. "From my mom?" I looked at him then, really looked at him, and understood how unprepared he was for what was coming. "From everything," I said. That night, after Zuri was asleep, he tried again. He told me his mother felt awful. He said she kept replaying the moment in her head. He said she was worried I might sue. That was when I knew Margaret had already started calculating. "I'm not discussing your mother right now," I said. "I'm focusing on recovery." He nodded, relieved to be spared a confrontation. He didn't realize that his relief was costing him leverage by the minute. The next morning, my attorney filed a request for the security footage preservation under routine legal grounds. No accusations, no drama, just a formal notice that data relevant to a potential injury claim should not be altered or deleted. Margaret wouldn't see it immediately, but the system would log it. That same day, I contacted a financial advisor I trusted and set up a temporary restructuring. I updated beneficiaries, I adjusted insurance policies, I made sure Zuri's education fund was insulated from any marital turbulence. Each task was small on its own. Together they formed a perimeter. Margaret called me twice. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail dripping with concern and thinly veiled irritation. "I hope you're not letting this turn into something bigger than it is," she said. "Families move past accidents." I saved the message. Caleb started asking questions after his credit card declined at a restaurant he frequented. Not for essentials, just the extras I quietly restricted. "Aisha, what's going on?" he asked that night, his voice edged with unease. "I'm taking precautions, temporary ones," I said. "Against what?" I didn't answer him immediately. I finished washing the dish in my hands, dried it, and set it down carefully before turning to face him. "Against instability," I said, "and against anyone who thinks I don't notice patterns." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the fall, he looked uncertain in a way that wasn't about me. It was about his mother. 2 days later, my attorney confirmed what Renee suspected. The cameras covered the staircase from 2 angles. The footage was clear. Margaret's hand was visible. The push was unmistakable. I didn't watch it right away. Knowing it existed was enough. The confirmation didn't bring satisfaction. It brought focus. From that moment on, every move had a purpose beyond survival. This was no longer about proving I had been wronged. It was about ensuring that no version of events could erase what actually happened. Margaret sensed the shift before she understood it. She called Caleb repeatedly, asking why I wasn't responding, why I hadn't thanked her for the flowers she sent, why things felt cold. He came to me one night after putting Zuri to bed, his voice low, tense. "She's scared," he said. "She thinks you're planning something." I met his gaze evenly. She should be careful about what she fears. Some things don't disappear just because you ignore them. He stared at me, searching for the wife who smoothed things over, who absorbed discomfort to keep peace.
She wasn't there anymore. I had already moved past the moment of shock, past the instinct to explain myself. I was no longer reacting to what Margaret had done. I was building the structure that would make sure she could never do it again. The first consequences didn't arrive with headlines or confrontations. They came the way real damage does, quietly and unevenly, spreading through Margaret's world before she realized anything had changed. Within a week of the brunch, invitations started drying up. At first, Margaret blamed timing. Then she blamed people's schedules. She mentioned it casually to Caleb during one of her daily calls, saying the women from the charity board were oddly distant and that a luncheon had been postponed without explanation. I knew better. Charlotte's social circles ran on perception more than facts. People didn't need proof to feel discomfort. They just needed enough uncertainty to step back. The fall had unsettled them. My absence unsettled them more. Silence, when it followed a public incident, made people nervous. Margaret's usual control depended on her being the one who defined events. This time she couldn't. I hadn't contradicted her publicly, but I hadn't affirmed her version either. I had simply stepped away, and that vacuum started doing work for me. Caleb began noticing changes before he admitted them out loud. His mother's calls shifted in tone, becoming sharper, more insistent. She asked questions that sounded like reassurance requests disguised as conversation. "Has anyone said anything to you?" she asked him one afternoon, her voice strained. "I feel like people are acting strange." He told her no because it was easier than telling her the truth, that people had stopped asking about her entirely. At Zuri's school, I felt the ripple effects more clearly. Parents who had smiled politely at Margaret during pickup now greeted me with warmer curiosity. One mother I barely knew touched my arm gently and said she was glad to see me up and walking again. She didn't mention the fall. She didn't need to. Her tone carried an understanding that surprised me. I thanked her and moved on, aware that Margaret's narrative was already losing traction without me lifting a finger. Margaret tried to regain control the way she always had, through social currency. She hosted another small gathering 2 weeks later, framing it as a continuation of her charity work. Caleb told me about it after the fact, his voice hesitant. "She wanted you there," he said. "She said it would help put everything behind us." I looked at him carefully. "And did you believe that?" He didn't answer right away. The gathering didn't go the way Margaret planned. People came late, left early, and avoided the staircase altogether. The laughter was thinner. Conversations felt guarded. A friend of hers who usually stayed for hours excused herself within 20 minutes. Margaret noticed everything. She always had. She started calling me again after that, leaving longer messages, her concern edged with frustration. "I don't understand why you're shutting me out," she said in one voicemail. "If you're hurt, we should talk like adults." I saved every message. Each one revealed a little more urgency, a little less confidence. Behind the scenes, my attorney's actions began to surface indirectly. The footage preservation request flagged Margaret's system, and although she hadn't been served with anything formal yet, she felt the shift. Contractors she used regularly suddenly insisted on paperwork. Her insurance agent asked questions she hadn't anticipated. She called Caleb in a panic one evening. "They're asking about the cameras," she said. "Why would they need that if it was just an accident?" Caleb relayed this to me later, his voice tense. "She thinks you're building a case." I didn't deny it. "I'm protecting myself," I said. "That's not an attack." He rubbed his face, exhaustion settling in. "She's scared." I held his gaze. So was I. The family dynamic shifted next. Caleb's brother, Aaron, stopped returning Margaret's calls as frequently. He had been present at the brunch and saw enough to make him uncomfortable. When Margaret tried to involve him, framing herself as the victim of overreaction, he deflected. "She needs space," he told Caleb. "Let things cool down." Margaret heard it as abandonment. Her frustration began leaking into public settings. At church, she made pointed comments about forgiveness and misunderstandings that felt out of place and personal. People listened politely, then changed the subject. Her usual influence was faltering. I watched all of this from a distance, staying focused on recovery and routine. Zuri went to school. I went to work part-time as my body healed. I kept my interactions neutral and brief. The steadiness unsettled people more than anger would have. Margaret expected escalation. She expected tears or accusations. What she got instead was distance and quiet preparation. One afternoon, Caleb came home early, visibly shaken. "My mom went to the house unannounced," he said. "Renee was there with you, right?" "Yes," I said. "She said Renee was watching her," he continued. "She thinks you're turning people against her." I exhaled slowly. "I'm not doing anything to her. I'm letting her see herself without the cover she's used for years."
That night, Margaret sent a message directly to me for the first time since the fall. "This has gone far enough. If you have something to say it to me. Don't ruin a family over pride." I read it twice and then closed my phone. By the end of the month, the first concrete consequence landed. Margaret was asked to step back temporarily from her role on the Charity Board to allow things to settle. The wording was gentle. The meaning was not. She called Caleb immediately, her composure finally cracking. "They're pushing me out. Because of her." Caleb looked at me as he repeated this, his expression caught between loyalty and recognition. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding spiraling out of control.
It was accountability arriving quietly. Margaret had built her power on being untouchable, on the assumption that no one would ever challenge her without collapsing under the weight of her influence. What she was learning now, piece by piece, was that influence only works when people are willing to carry it. And they were starting to set it down. The fall had shaken me physically. The silence that followed was shaking her. The second confrontation didn't happen by accident. Margaret engineered it the way she engineered everything else in her life, through appearances, timing, and the assumption that she still controlled the room. She invited us to a charity fundraising dinner at a private restaurant downtown, one of the places where waiters knew her by name and the manager greeted her personally. The invitation came through Caleb, not me. She framed it as a chance to clear the air in front of people who mattered, which told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want resolution. She wanted rehabilitation. I agreed to go. Caleb looked relieved when I said yes, mistaking my calm for reconciliation. He didn't understand yet that I had already moved past the need to be understood. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to let Margaret expose herself. The restaurant was exactly what she wanted it to be. Candlelit tables, low music, familiar faces from the charity board, church committees, and social circles that overlapped just enough to amplify embarrassment when it landed. Margaret arrived early, greeting people with practiced warmth, already working to reset her image. When we walked in, conversation softened around us. People noticed. They always did when tension entered a space they preferred to keep polished. Margaret turned, spotted me, and smiled with visible relief, as if my presence alone validated her version of events. "Aisha," she said loudly, stepping forward, "I'm so glad you came." I returned the smile without warmth. "You invited us." She touched my arm lightly, a gesture meant for witnesses rather than connection. "I thought it would be good for everyone to see that we're moving forward." I didn't answer her. I didn't need to. The silence did enough work on its own. We were seated at a long table near the center of the room, surrounded by people who had heard just enough about the fall to be curious, but not enough to be comfortable. Margaret positioned herself at the head, as always. Caleb sat beside me, tense and quiet. Dinner progressed politely at first. Margaret dominated the conversation, talking about upcoming events, future plans, and her continued commitment to community service. She laughed easily, but there was a brittleness beneath it that hadn't been there before. She checked the room more often than usual, measuring reactions, adjusting tone. Halfway through the meal, she raised her glass. "I just want to say something," she said, smiling broadly. "I know the past few weeks have been uncomfortable. Accidents happen and misunderstandings grow when people don't communicate." She glanced at me pointedly. "But families should handle things privately, with grace," she continued, "not through distance or suspicion." The room went quiet. Forks paused midair. This was what she had wanted, a public moral high ground. I set my napkin down carefully before speaking. "Margaret," I said evenly, "do you remember what you said immediately after I fell?" Her smile flickered. "I said you slipped." "Yes," I said. "You said it before anyone asked." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Margaret laughed lightly, waving a hand. "Well, that's what happened." I nodded slowly. "That's what you said." The distinction waned. She straightened in her chair. Aisha, this really isn't the place. You're right, it isn't the place for rewriting events. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. You've asked why I've kept distance. You've suggested it's pride or misunderstanding. I want to be clear so there's no confusion. The room had gone still. Even the waitstaff lingered at a distance. I didn't need time because I was injured, and because I was deciding how to protect myself and my daughter. Margaret leaned forward, voice tightening. From what, exactly? I met her gaze steadily. From people who speak for me before I can speak for myself, and from situations where truth is decided by whoever talks first. A murmur rippled through the table. Margaret's composure cracked for the first time that evening. You're implying something serious, she said sharply. If you have an accusation, you should make it properly. I am being proper, I replied. I'm being precise. She scoffed. So what is this, a threat? I shook my head. It's a boundary. She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could regain control. I won't discuss the details of what happened here, I said, gesturing subtly around us. I won't debate memory or intention. That's not necessary. Margaret's voice rose. Then why bring it up at all? Because you keep asking why things have changed. This is why. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You're doing this to humiliate me. I remained seated. No, I said calmly. I'm declining to participate in a version of events that puts me at risk. The contrast was unmistakable. Her agitation, my stillness. Someone at the table cleared their throat. Another person looked down at their plate. The power Margaret relied on depended on composure, and she was losing it. This is absurd, she said, her voice tight. I opened my home to you. I welcomed you into my family. And I trusted you, I replied. That trust ended on the staircase. Silence fell heavily over the table. Margaret looked around, searching for support, for someone to redirect the moment. No one moved. Caleb finally spoke, his voice low but audible. Maybe, Mom, we should stop. She turned on him, disbelief flashing across her face.
You're taking her side? I'm taking reality seriously, he said quietly. That was the moment the room shifted fully. The conflict was no longer abstract. It had weight. Margaret grabbed her purse, hands trembling. I won't sit here and be accused, she said. Not like this. I stood then, steady despite the ache in my body. You're not being accused tonight, I said. You're being observed. Her face flushed with anger and something closer to fear. I leaned slightly toward her, lowering my voice just enough that only those closest could hear. Careful, I said. Public stories don't age well when facts arrive. I didn't wait for her response. I took my coat, nodded politely to the table, and walked out of the restaurant with Caleb behind me. As the door closed, I felt the weight of the room shift inward, collapsing around Margaret. She had wanted a stage. She hadn't realized she no longer controlled the script. And as I stepped into the night air, I knew the line had landed exactly where it needed to. Margaret did not retreat after the dinner. She had never retreated from anything in her life. What she did instead was try to regain control by accelerating the story, convinced that speed and repetition could outrun facts she did not yet fully understand. The morning after the restaurant confrontation, she started calling people, not close friends, not confidants, but the outer ring of her social circle, the ones who liked her but did not know her well enough to question her. She framed the narrative carefully, presenting herself as a woman blindsided by hostility she could not explain. She told them I was fragile, that I was misinterpreting stress as betrayal, that I had become distant and unpredictable after the fall. She emphasized concern, not blame, and positioned herself as the worried elder watching a family unravel. It might have worked months earlier. Now it only amplified attention. By midday, I had received 3 messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years. They were polite, cautious, and revealing in what they did not say. No one asked what I had done wrong. They asked if I was okay. Margaret sensed the shift immediately.
Her calls to Caleb increased, each one sharper than the last. She asked him why people were suddenly quiet, why invitations were being declined, why the charity board had postponed its next meeting again. Caleb listened, said little, and told her he didn't know. That answer unsettled her more than an argument would have. Margaret relied on access to information as much as influence, and both were slipping away. That same afternoon, my attorney called. "She's trying to preempt," she said. "That usually means someone realizes the ground is unstable." I told her Margaret was speaking publicly again. "Let her," she replied. "Noise doesn't erase records." 2 days later, the first concrete escalation landed. A mutual acquaintance forwarded me a message Margaret had sent in a private group chat, meant to rally sympathy. She hadn't named me directly, but the implications were unmistakable. She wrote about loyalty, about ingratitude, about how dangerous it was when people turned family disagreements into public suspicion. She warned that reputations could be destroyed over misunderstandings, and that grace was becoming rare. The message circulated quietly. Screenshots traveled faster than she realized. I didn't respond. I forwarded everything to my attorney. By the end of the week, whispers had hardened into questions. People started connecting timelines. They remembered how quickly Margaret had spoken after the fall, how confidently she had explained it, how aggressively she now insisted it was being exaggerated. The escalation Margaret intended to control was now out of her hands. The next move came from her, not through words but through action. She contacted her insurance company and reported the incident formally, framing it as a household accident with potential liability exposure. The report triggered a routine inquiry. That inquiry intersected with my attorney's preservation notice. The collision of those two processes forced the system to look more closely than Margaret anticipated. Requests were made, files were flagged, access logs were reviewed. Margaret called Caleb late that night, her voice strained and unfamiliar. "They're asking for the footage," she said. "All of it." Caleb relayed this to me the next morning, his face pale. "What footage?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The cameras," I said simply. He stared at me. "You knew?" "I suspected," I replied. "Now it's confirmed." The escalation reached a new level when the footage was reviewed by third parties. Not released, not shown publicly, reviewed. That distinction mattered more than Margaret understood. Facts don't need an audience to change outcomes. They only need credibility. My attorney called me once more, her voice calm. "The video is clear," she said. "There's no ambiguity." I closed my eyes briefly, not from relief, but from the finality of it. Once truth exists in that form, denial becomes strategy rather than confusion. Margaret reacted exactly as expected. She denied everything. She accused technology of distortion. She suggested camera angles could be misleading. She implied that proximity might look like contact to an untrained eye. She underestimated how tired people were of explanations. Caleb confronted her privately after that, not with anger but with questions she could not answer without unraveling herself. "Why did you say she slipped before anyone saw anything?" he asked. She deflected. "Why were you standing that close behind her?" he pressed. She grew defensive. "Why didn't you tell me there were cameras on the stairs?" he asked finally. She went silent. That silence did more damage than any accusation. Margaret tried one last narrative reversal. She suggested that I was planning to release the footage maliciously, that I wanted to embarrass her, that this was revenge, not protection. The irony was almost impressive. I never released anything. I didn't need to. The fact that the footage existed, that it had been reviewed, and that it contradicted her account was enough to reverse public opinion. People stopped repeating her words. They started distancing themselves without explanation. The charity board made its move quietly, voting to suspend her role indefinitely pending personal matters. Church leadership encouraged her to take a step back from public-facing responsibilities. Friends stopped asking her to host. Margaret's escalation had achieved the opposite of what she intended. Every attempt to speak made the silence around her louder. One evening, as I sat with Zuri working through homework at the kitchen table, Caleb watched us with an expression I hadn't seen before.
It wasn't guilt, it was understanding. "She's losing everything," he said quietly. I looked at him. "She built it all on control. That's fragile by design." He nodded slowly. "And you?" "I'm not escalating," I said. "I'm finishing what she started." Outside, the world kept moving. Inside Margaret's carefully constructed life, the walls were closing in, not with drama or spectacle, but with documented truth and the slow withdrawal of belief. She had tried to outrun reality. Reality had waited, and it was catching up. Once the footage entered the legal process, everything accelerated in ways Margaret could no longer manage with charm or denial. Systems do not care about reputation. They care about sequence, documentation, and liability. And for the first time in her life, Margaret was being measured by something that did not bend for her. My attorney filed the civil complaint quietly. No press, no statements, just facts laid out in a timeline that spoke for itself. The claim focused on injury, negligence, and intentional conduct supported by video evidence. Margaret was served at home on a Tuesday morning, the paperwork delivered by someone who had no idea who she was and no interest in who she used to be. She called Caleb immediately. "They're treating me like a criminal," she said, her voice breaking in a way that sounded more shocked than distressed. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said something that marked a permanent shift between them. "They're treating this seriously," he replied. "That's not the same thing." She accused him of abandoning her. She accused me of manipulating him. She accused everyone except herself. When none of it changed the outcome, her anger turned to desperation. The financial fallout followed quickly. Her homeowner's insurance reserved its position pending investigation, which meant legal fees were suddenly her responsibility. Accounts she had always treated as flexible buffers became finite. Bills she never worried about demanded attention. She asked Caleb for help. Not support. Help. He came to me before responding, his face tight. "She wants me to cover her attorney," he said, "just until things settle." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. "If you do that," I said, "you are choosing her version of events over documented reality. And you are choosing to fund the defense of someone who hurt your wife." He didn't answer right away. He left the room, paced, came back, and sat down heavily. "I can't do it," he said finally. "Not anymore." That refusal fractured something fundamental. Margaret had always relied on access to her son's resources, emotional and financial. Losing that access stripped away the last illusion of control. Her other son withdrew next. He sent a message saying he needed distance and would not be involved in family conflicts with legal implications. It was the most careful way he could say he believed the evidence. Margaret's isolation became complete. The court issued a temporary protective order restricting contact pending resolution. It was procedural, unemotional, and devastating to her sense of authority. She could no longer call me. She could no longer show up unannounced. Any violation would worsen her position. She left a voicemail for Caleb that night, her voice raw. "I raised you better than this," she said. "I never thought you'd turn your back on me." He didn't return the call. The legal process moved forward with efficiency. Medical records were submitted, expert analysis confirmed injury consistency with force, the footage timeline matched witness statements. Every attempt by Margaret's counsel to introduce ambiguity collapsed under review. Settlement discussions began before discovery even closed. Margaret wanted silence in exchange for money she no longer fully controlled. The irony was that silence was never my leverage. The truth was. My attorney advised a structured resolution that protected Zuri, secured long-term boundaries, and ensured accountability without spectacle. I agreed. I had no interest in dragging this out for emotional satisfaction. Margaret signed the agreement 3 weeks later. The terms were final. Financial penalties, mandatory counseling, permanent no-contact provisions, a formal acknowledgement of responsibility that would remain sealed unless violated. When Caleb told her the outcome, she didn't cry. She went quiet. In the weeks that followed, her life shrank rapidly. The house felt too large without gatherings. The phone stayed silent. Invitations stopped entirely. People moved on with a speed that stunned her. I heard later that she tried to explain herself to a neighbor and was met with polite discomfort. Not confrontation, not forgiveness, just distance.
That was the final consequence. Not loss of money, not loss of status, loss of relevance. And as the legal chapter closed, I felt something unexpected settle in its place. Not triumph, not relief, stability. The kind that doesn't require vigilance because the threat has been dismantled at its source. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or a public space. It happened because Margaret asked for it, convinced that one last conversation could still restore something she had already lost. The request came through her attorney, formal and restrained. She wanted a private meeting before the settlement terms were finalized. No witnesses, no recording devices, just the two of us, with counsel present but silent. I agreed on one condition. The meeting would take place in a neutral office building, during business hours, with doors open and distance maintained. No exceptions. When I arrived, Margaret was already seated at the far end of the conference table. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically fragile, but diminished by the absence of certainty that had once held her upright. Her blonde hair was still styled carefully. Her clothes were still expensive, but the authority was gone. She stood when I entered, hesitated, then sat back down. "Aisha," she said quietly, "thank you for coming." I nodded and took the chair across from her, setting my bag at my feet. Our attorneys exchanged brief greetings and took seats along the wall. The room felt professional, restrained, deliberately unpersonal. Margaret folded her hands together, then unfolded them again. She looked at the table instead of at me. "I never wanted things to go this far," she said. I waited. Silence was no longer uncomfortable for me. She cleared her throat. "I know you think I did something unforgivable. I won't pretend I handled that day perfectly, but I don't believe it deserves to end my life." The phrasing struck me. Not our relationship, not our family, her life. "I'm not ending your life," I said calmly. "I'm ending your access to mine." Her head lifted then, eyes sharp with something close to fear. "You're destroying everything I built." "No," I replied. "I'm stepping out of what you built and refusing to be crushed by it." She exhaled shakily. "We're family." I shook my head. Family doesn't decide the truth before the injured person can speak. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time, she seemed uncertain about which version of herself would work here. "I made a mistake," she said. "I panicked." I leaned back slightly, maintaining the distance. Panic doesn't explain precision. You spoke before anyone asked. You framed it before anyone saw. Her voice rose. "You're acting like I planned it." "I'm acting like I don't need to argue intent when evidence exists," I said. Her hands began to tremble. "You're taking my son from me," she said, her voice breaking. "You're poisoning him against his own mother." I held her gaze steadily. "Your son saw what you did. That's not poisoning, that's consequence." She pressed her lips together, then tried another approach. "What do you want?" she asked. "Money? An apology? Control?" I didn't hesitate. "I want distance," I said. "Permanent distance. I want my daughter raised without fear. I want my home free from manipulation, and I want you to understand that none of this is negotiable." Tears welled in her eyes then, genuine this time. "I raised him. I gave him everything." "And I gave him stability," I replied. "Those things are not the same." She covered her face briefly, shoulders shaking. "I can change," she said quietly. "I'll say whatever you need me to say." I waited until she looked at me again. "This isn't about words, it's about behavior, and I'm not staying close enough to monitor yours." Her attorney shifted uncomfortably. Mine remained still. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "If you do this, I'll be alone." I met her gaze without cruelty. "You chose that path when you decided my body was collateral," I said. I'm just stepping off it. Silence settled heavily over the room, the kind that marks an ending rather than a pause. She straightened slowly, wiping her face, and looked at me with something that wasn't anger anymore. "You're very cold," she said. I shook my head. "I'm clear." I stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Our attorneys rose as well. "There will be no more conversations, no calls, no messages, no indirect contact. If you violate the agreement, the sealed record becomes public." She swallowed hard. "You would really do that?" "I already have," I replied. As I walked toward the door, she spoke one last time. "You think you won." I paused, hand on the handle, and turned back just enough for her to hear me. This was never a competition, it was an extraction. Then I left. I didn't look back. Some endings don't need witnesses. They just need boundaries that finally hold. 6 months passed without drama, which is how I knew the hardest part was over. Real peace doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly, in the absence of tension you didn't realize you were carrying until it's gone. Mornings became quieter. My shoulders stopped tightening when my phone rang. My home felt like mine again, not a space I had to defend. I didn't win anything. I didn't seek revenge for its own sake. I extracted myself from a structure designed to break me quietly, and I refused to carry someone else's denial as my burden. Margaret became a chapter people stopped reading. I became a woman who could breathe again. And that was the ending I chose.